Our next panelist is Dr. Wilfred McClay. Dr. McClay serves as the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma and is one of the most well-respected scholars currently active in the field. His book, The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, was awarded the Merle Curti Award of the Organization of American Historians for being the best book in American intellectual history. Dr. McClay's presentation is entitled Thoughts on the Preconditions for Active Citizenship. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Father, and I guess I should say hi, Mom. Whatever moms are watching, but Paul's mom in particular. Yes, well, they believe in liberty, too. Isn't that nice? Thinking about my title, Preconditions for Active Citizenship, it seemed to me there are basically two aspects to the subject. There's the question of the formation of citizens, forming the minds and hearts of the kinds of people who will be effective individual citizens. And second, sustaining the institutional structures within which they are able to act as citizens. You don't want to have citizens being all dressed up with nowhere to go and be citizens. But the two things are analytically distinct, but they're not really distinct in fact. Feedback effects link them. Civic activity itself can be a kind of school of the soul, can help form the individual, teach certain virtues, honesty, reciprocity, accountability, fortitude. And by the way, commerce can similarly teach some of these things and other virtues besides, as some of the great classical liberal philosophers pointed out. And we need informed and enlightened individuals to create and sustain the proper venues for civic activity. So it works from both sides. I'm reminded of all this thinking about one of my students, a really brilliant student this semester. And actually, I'm thinking about having to go back today and face his thesis that is metastasizing into something enormous, in which he's arguing for the introduction of mandatory voting as a way of, by compelling the vote, solving the problem of voter suppression and all of the sort of fraud, allegations of fraud and so on associated with voting. No more voter registration. Everybody is automatically registered, and inducing a certain kind of citizenship through the compulsory electoral activity. I'm just giving him enough rope to hang himself on this. That's part of my job. Or as William Blake said, the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. So, and this does reflect a laudable desire on one level, a certain kind of republicanism, a small r republicanism, but with a, shall we say, an absence of attention to the element of liberty. As some forms of republicanism, compulsory republicanism, do. It's a wrong understanding. And also, there's a lot of talk about civic education in our time. Everybody's for civic education, but a lot of what people are talking about is the wrong kind of civic education. I'll get to that in a moment. Of course, the idea that that higher education, which I'm mainly going to talk about because that's my world, includes education for citizenship, goes back a long way. It goes back at least to Thomas Jefferson. His 1818 report of the commissioners of the University of Virginia called for each citizen to understand, I'm quoting here, to understand his duties to his neighbors and his country, discharge with competence the functions confided to him by either, to know his rights, exercise with order and justice those he retains, choose with discretion fiduciary of those he delegates, and to notice their conduct with diligence, candor, and judgment, to develop the reasoning faculties of our youth, enlarge their minds, cultivate their morals, and instill into them the precepts of virtue and order, and similarly form statesmen through the study of government, law, political economy, ethics, languages, mathematics, and the sciences. But that was then. Now, within the academy, the tides have shifted, particularly since the 1960s, and education for citizenship is much less likely to be viewed affirmatively or in any kind of straightforward way. The influential philosopher Martha Nussbaum has argued that patriotism itself is an inferior sentiment, and that, quote, patriotic pride is both morally dangerous and ultimately subversive of some of the worthy goals patriotism sets out to serve, such as national unity or moral ideas of justice and equality. These goals, she said, would be better served by the old ideal of the cosmopolitan, the person whose allegiance is to the worldwide community of human beings. And it is the job of the university to instill that ideal, and in so doing displace the dangerous idols of the nation state. So what to think then of an example that John Fonte, the historian, provides in his book, Sovereignty or Submission? Fonte has, any of you who've ever seen this book, you may know what I'm referring to. There's an advertisement he reproduces from New York University's Center for Global Affairs, a recruiting advertisement. Pictures two young people standing in front of the UN building in New York, with a caption that asks the following question: as a global citizen, to whom do I pledge allegiance? How about that? Yes. The point of the ad, Fonte argues, is to attract students to the center by associating the center with skepticism about the very concept of national loyalty and support for the idea that once the global citizen is affirmed, the particular loyalties of an American citizen must perforce disappear. As this example implies, one approach to the problem of citizenship education is to redefine it into something else. That was precisely the strategy adopted by a study by the National Task Force on Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement. Who could object to any of those things? Entitled A Crucible Moment. I've never figured out what a crucible moment is, but College Learning and Democracy's Future. And the report begins by saying the nation needs to reclaim higher education's civic mission and criticizing any view of education that limits the mission of higher education to workforce preparation and training while marginalizing disciplines basic to democracy. Again, who could argue with that? But it soon emerges that the alternative to workforce preparation is not liberal education in the traditional sense, but social activism. The report interprets citizenship not as an activity in the local polity, but activism on the national or world stage. It interprets civic engagement as the making of commitments to a very familiar list of social and political causes: universal health care, global warming, income inequality, tutti quanti, transnational and secular goals to the core. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the particular causes is beside the point. The point is that such an approach to education is not designed to equip young men and women for discerning, reflective, independent-minded participation in the ongoing life of their own communities, of their own polities. Instead, it seeks to mobilize them. It's a kind of workforce preparation itself. It mobilizes them to fight unreflectively for global causes whose righteousness has taken to be self-evident truth. Such an approach to education for citizenship would have to be deemed to cure hardly distinguishable from the disease itself. A far better approach, I think, is Jefferson's. That is liberal education, as traditionally understood. There is an argument that liberal education is not the best form of education for citizens because it encourages a kind of deep questioning that can only result in undermining citizens' loyalties to their regime. This is the sort of thing that Socrates was charged with by his Athenian accusers. I see the power of the argument, but I think it proceeds from a misunderstanding of what liberal education is, or at least ought to be, and of what a citizen looks like in our polity, in our regime. Liberal education, to be worthy of the name, has to have two related but competing goals. And I call these goals, for lack of a better terms, liberation and membership. There may be better words, but these are the ones I've settled on. Liberation, by that I mean, by that much tortured word, I mean freeing the individual from confinement to the conditions of his or her birth, from the tyranny of received opinion, unthinking prejudice, superstition, passions, thought control, opening up to them a world of inquiry in which the weight of the past is set aside and one is freed, like the prisoners in Plato's famous allegory of the cave, freed to ascend into the light. But membership also, and I say is a competing goal of liberal education, the achievement of a sufficient level of knowledge of one's own society, of its institutions, its past, to make it possible for the individual to appropriate their rightful inheritance, to participate fully in the life of their society with a feeling of belonging to it and in it, of being loyal to it and being committed to its welfare, even willing in some ways to subordinate oneself to its greater needs. The tension between these two things goes back to Socrates, to the very origins of philosophy, the tension between the philosopher's love of truth and the unimpeded search for it on the one hand, and on the other hand, his or her love of the city, the community, the polity of which they're a member, towards which one has certain civic duties and loyalties. The philosopher in this sense is seen as the gadfly, as Socrates denominated himself, whose search for truth leads him to be willing to puncture public myths, challenge every form of complacency and civic self-congratulation, even if doing so wounds the self-regard of the citizenry. The contrast is between the capacity for fearless independent inquiry, which faces the world as if it had been freshly created for consideration at that very moment, versus the capacity to see one's actions steadily in the light of those who came before one, with grateful, respectful regard for those that one dwells with and for whom one makes a life in common, to make responsible and constructive contributions to one's society, to the common weal. It's a contrast between Jefferson's idea that the earth belongs to the living and Burke's notion that civil society is a partnership in memory and hope between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. There is a naturalness to patriotism as an expression of love for what is one's own, gratitude for what one's been given, reverence for the sources of one's being. These dispositions are more visceral than intellectual. They're grounded in our natures, the basic facts of our natality. Yet their power is no less for that, and they're denied only at great cost. There are many meanings in Aristotle's famous declaration that we are by nature political animals, but one of them, surely, is that we are in some sense made to live in community with one another. It is our nature, it is in our nature to be belonging creatures. And one of the deepest needs of the human soul is a sense of membership, of joy in what we have and hold in common with others. Among our deepest longings is the desire to belong. And it is an illusion to believe we can sustain a stable identity in isolation, living apart from the eyes and ears and words and even judgments of others. Only beasts and gods dwell outside the city, Aristotle famously said. And no city and nation can long survive in the absence of civic virtues and the loyalties that flow from them. Virtue was, for Aristotle, a kind of natural excellence that nevertheless required much striving to be achieved. Its task was prescriptive and aspirational, and it aspired to a kind of self-transcendence. In any event, to return to the larger theme, both of these tendencies, both of these goals are or should be part of liberal education. A high commitment to the capacity for rational criticism and a high capacity for loyalty, reverence, and love. Without criticism, there's no progress, no improvement, no movement towards greater knowledge. But without the capacity for loyalty and love, there's no belonging, no memory, no steadiness or fixity in the objects of love, no willingness to sacrifice for the common good. Nothing left but the free-floating, autonomous individual who vainly and pathetically imagines that he is his own creation. Well, in this sense, our universities are maybe failing us in both ways. Both by traducing their responsibility to protect free, rational, open inquiry, but also by abdicating their responsibility to be places of cultural conservation, where the voices of the past are preserved and accorded a place in the civilization's ongoing life. And we're taught to grant those voices our respect and gratitude. These days, universities aren't doing either one of these things. So civic education is needed, but civic education is not enough. We also need, to go back to the second of my opening distinctions, we need institutions within which the activity of citizenship and the exercise of civic virtues is possible. And this is one of the great assets of the American federal system, at least as initially conceived and when allowed to operate properly. The insights of Alexis de Tocqueville, who we'll be hearing more about this afternoon, are especially valuable here. Federalism was one of the things Tocqueville admired about America. He feared many things about America. He feared the conformity, the tendency towards conformity of American society. He saw American patriotism as defensive. He was actually rather contemptuous of American patriotism. It was querulous and skittish. Yet he had unqualified admiration for the federal political institutions that Americans had devised to accomplish the task of governance. He marveled that even the humblest of Americans, this is writing in the 1830s, of course, had an instinctive grasp of federalism. I won't read this whole quotation, but he says, "I've never been more struck by the good sense and practical judgment of the Americans than in the manner in which they elude the numberless difficulties resulting from their federal constitution. I scarcely ever met with a plain American citizen who could not distinguish with surprising facility the obligations created by the laws of Congress from the laws of his own state," and so on and so forth. Well, times have changed in that regard, haven't they? But my point is that complexity was not a bug, but a feature in the original federal scheme. It's precisely the genius of federalism, and American federalism in particular, to divide political power between and among units of government, central and local, higher and lower, more or less comprehensive, in such a way that all retain certain elements of autonomy and self-governance. Federalism thus offers the prospect of reconciling the advantages of independence with the advantages of combination, the cohesiveness and diversity of smaller scale local organizations with the material resources and external power provided by a unified nation state. The federal idea is really grounded in two basic assumptions. One of them is negative and the other is positive. The negative one is the better known one. Framers distrusted power, distrusted the concentration of power, distrusted government, distrusted majorities, distrusted human nature. They believed in, as Madison put it, the necessity of auxiliary precautions to guard against the abuses of power that came out of the concentration of power, particularly in popular governments. Hence the need to oppose rival interests, make ambition to counteract ambition, Madison's famous words, is part of the whole federal arrangement. The separation of national and state governments and the separation of powers within each level of government provided a double security for the people's rights by dispersing power. Oh dear, 5 minutes. But what I really wanted to talk about is the negative, the positive aspect of federalism, that it makes possible the vitality of smaller scale forms of political association and organization. And it leaves room for the exercise of the civic virtues. Not everyone can be a senator, but nearly anyone can be an alderman or a county commissioner or serve on a jury or otherwise play a role in their local, to use Burke's term, platoon. Since my time is wasting here, I'm going to move ahead and make one other point that I wanted to make, which is that it's really a kind of something I should give a lot more attention to, but also it's part of this institutional framework within which civic virtues can be exercised. I want to mention, even though it's not a citizenship function, it really is something that Acton is concerned about, and that is that we need to maximize points of entry into participation in the economy. Work is formative too. Just as the activity of civic life, I say, is a school of the soul, work is a school of the soul. Work gives us many of the same, as does commerce, as does civic life, gives us many of the same virtues through doing. And here I think is the right point to mention our absurd addiction to credentialism in our culture, which is it's an absurdity to think that you need a college education to participate in the workforce in any meaningful way. We have too much of that, too many barriers, too much schooling, too much hegemony of the schooled, too much licensing, too much regulation of experience, too little space to move around and find our own way, experiment, make mistakes. That's the dynamism of a free economy. And exercise personal initiative without the supervision of experts, licensure bureaus, nannies, busybodies, and others who ought to mind their own business. What does it tell us? That the greatest orator in American history, a man whose command of the English language and the principles of constitutional democracy is without peer, was a largely unschooled, self-educated man without social advantages. I am, of course, talking about Abraham Lincoln, but a man who had the good fortune to come of age with one inestimable advantage. He lived in a more loose-jointed, less organized environment of antebellum America, an arena that was remarkably well calibrated to the development of his talents, both as a politician and in other ways. Harry Truman, probably our most historically minded president of the post-World War II era, was a man that had only a high school education. He graduated from high school and almost immediately after taking some courses in bookkeeping, went to work for the Santa Fe Railroad. That's an admirable path that seems not to be open to anyone anymore. This less organized America had many faults, but I think many advantages that we would do well to recover. We need to restore a less regimented, less status stratified, less school sorted, more open-ended America. Thank you.